Hey everyone, Sean from Precision DynoTech here. In this video, we're going to talk about our RevBench software and getting it set up. Our RevBench software is used with all of our data acquisition units for dynos. So the models DC1, DC2, and DC3 are all going to use this software. In this video, we're only going to talk about a few settings pages just because there are a lot of settings to go over. But we do want to talk about the most important ones, and that's setting up our RPM, our load cell, and our power calculation settings. So to get started, we're going to go up to our settings page. So click Settings, Main Settings. And on the left-hand side right here, you can see we've got a whole bunch of settings pages, and we're only going to focus on the RPM input settings, the load cell settings, and the power calculation settings. So to start off, we go to RPM input settings. And depending on which device you have, if you have only one RPM input on your device, you'll only see one tab up here. But if you have two, you will see two tabs, and you'll be able to configure each one independently. So we're only using RPM 1 today for the purposes of this video, which I should mention, I've got a signal generator hooked up to the RPM input on one of our devices here. That's just so I'm not trying to talk over a loud engine. And I've also got some other devices as well, so something that's simulating a load cell and an analog input. So getting back to our RPM settings, we can see we have pulses per revolution. So that's how many pulses that the acquisition unit is going to see per one revolution of the shaft that your sensor is looking at. So if you have a tone wheel and you're using a Hall effect sensor, which is what we generally always recommend if possible for your situation, let's say your tone wheel has 10 teeth on it. You would put 10 in pulses per revolution here. Our median filter window, this is looking at basically the last three, in this case, samples for RPM value, and it's taking the median of them. You can increase this number, and generally we say to keep it odd. You can do even, but it's effectively going to change it to an odd-sized window. But regardless, it will smooth out your data if it's quite noisy. However, it will introduce some latency to the signal as well. 3 or 5 is usually good. Once you start getting to 7 or higher, you probably will start noticing some lag. Sensor type. We have this set to other right now because all the settings below this are settings that actually get sent to our firmware on the device itself. So right now, other allows us to really define all these individual settings, our slice level, our signal edge, and our max RPM. So let's talk about those. The slice level is simply the voltage that any signal going to the RPM input must attain in order to be considered a valid RPM signal. If it does not get to, in this case, at least 4,095 millivolts, then it will not cause an RPM signal. And the device will simply ignore that pulse. So if you're getting a lot of lag, check and make sure, or sorry, not a lot of lag, a lot of noise, check and make sure that this value is not set to something very low. The default is 4,095 millivolts. In the vast majority of cases, just leave this set this way. Signal edge. So when we have a signal, we have a pulse, right? We have a rising edge to the pulse and a falling edge. So for most cases, a falling edge is generally what we want. A rising edge might make more sense if you're using like a points ignition signal for your RPM input. That'd be like the coming off of your coil that would go to a tachometer in a car. It's like if you had that connected to our data unit. You'd probably want to use a rising edge right here. Then we have our max RPM. This max RPM value is actually a raw RPM value. So right now we have 10 pulses per revolution, and we can see our RPM that it's measuring right now, but the raw RPM is actually 10 times that amount. So in this case, we're actually, if we were to put this to 1, for instance, right now, we're over 100,000 RPM as far as a raw value. Now, if it were to go over 187,500, it's actually going to start ignoring anything that causes that signal to be above that. So generally, leaving it at this value, the 187,500, is generally advisable if you're using like a Hall effect sensor. Where this really helps is, and again, reducing noise. So if you're using a points ignition, for instance, let's say you have 2 pulses per revolution of your engine on a points ignition, which is generally the case in like a 4-cylinder at least. Let's say your max RPM you want to measure is 6,000 RPM. We know we have 2 pulses per rev there. So 12,000 would be our max RPM. So we might set this to like 13,000 just to be slightly above that. And any errant signal, any errant noise that would otherwise cause that signal to read higher than 13,000 will simply be ignored. Simple as that. This is actually the same way that we do, well, one of the ways that we do digital signal filtering in our TF2 TAC filters that we also sell. Our averaging window here, this is simply looking at any of the samples recorded within the last 20 milliseconds in this particular case. And it's taking an average of those values, and that's how the device is calculating RPM. So we can increase this to get a larger average, of course. 20 is generally advisable to keep it at that. A low pass filter, again, check this if you have a lot of noise. If it helps, great. If it doesn't, you can uncheck it. So all these settings, like I said, you don't necessarily have to set these. So if you have a Hall effect, we have some sort of presets here. And if we click Hall effect, it's actually on the back end going to set those settings to what's appropriate for a Hall effect sensor. Same thing for points ignition, infrared photo, inductive, and of course other is what we're looking at. So we can define those however we'd like. Looking further down here, we have virtual RPM settings. So this is a secondary channel that is simply applying a ratio to your RPM input channel. In this case, we have it set to 2. Oh, let me set this back to 10 for our pulses per rev for the sake of the video. We're getting some crazy high RPM values over here. All right, so again, we're pretending that we have like a 10-tooth tone wheel that we're getting our RPM signal from. And then we have our RPM 1 gear ratio. So again, this is simply just applying a ratio to whatever the RPM input channel is. So right now it's set to 2 for the purposes of this video. And the ratio calculator tool, I don't want to get into a lot of detail here, but if you don't know your gear ratio for some reason, but you have some way of measuring your known engine RPM, you can then set your known engine RPM, click calculate ratio, and then it'll automatically calculate whatever gear ratio you have here. Most cases, people already know this ratio. Usually it's like, one sprocket to another if you're driving a brake with a chain drive or something. All right, so those are our RPM input settings. Next up, we have to go to our load cell settings. So our load cell, in this settings window, we have a calibration weight. We have our calibration arm length, which is not always the same as our torque arm length. So the torque arm length is the length of the arm from the center line of your brake going out to the pickup point that goes to your load cell. I try to always make this 12 inches on any of the dynos that I work on because it's easy math. 1 pound would equal, 1 pound-foot of torque. However, some torque arms are, of course, different lengths. So input that torque arm length right here. And then for calibration, if you notice that these are grayed out, it's because in this instance, we have the override calibration on. So let's unclick that for the purposes of the video. So you have your calibration weight, and this, of course, we want to know pretty accurately. That's going to help in the total accuracy of our dyno. And then our calibration arm length. So in some dynos, you have a separate calibration arm that you can put onto the brake to effectively get higher torque values. This could be, let's say a 24-inch calibration arm. So that means we'd be hanging 10 pounds off of an arm that's 24 inches from the center line of the brake shaft. And our load cell, of course, is still at 12 inches. It's attached to a separate arm. So once all this is set up, before you hang your weight, you want to zero your load cell. And then after it's zeroed, you're going to hang your weight and then click calibrate. At that point, it's going to calculate a certain value. It's sort of an arbitrary number, but it's counts per gram. These are digital counts. And that's going to populate this field right here. Now, if you already know your counts per gram, you can simply click override calibration and enter that value in here and click apply. But generally, this is the calibration procedure. So again, you set up your calibration arm, get that all set up, but don't put the weight on. You're going to click zero load cell, then hang your weight, make sure it's not swinging or anything, and then click Calibrate, and that will calibrate your load cell. Load cell filtering, this is simply just going to smooth out the data. Sometimes there's a lot of noise from vibration from the dyno and the entire system. This helps quite a bit. It does introduce a little bit of latency, but generally it's not that bad, and it really reduces the amount of noise. So in most cases, I recommend to have this checked. And then auto zero load cell, this is a really neat feature. So this is going to, when enabled, it's going to zero the load cell automatically every 10 seconds if there is no RPM input. And then after it does see an RPM input, it's going to go back 20 seconds and look at what that 0 point was. The reason this is important is because load cells, a lot of the S-beam load cells that are not super expensive, don't have any sort of compensation for thermal expansion in them. So they will drift off their zero ever so slightly over the course of a dyno session. So in older versions of the software, I'd always tell people to make sure that you zero it before you turn the engine on for a run. It's easy to forget to do that. So this kind of gets rid of having to remember that. So pretty helpful. Also, one good thing to note that even if you have this checked, it is not going to auto zero while this settings page is open. So this function is actually disabled at the moment simply because the settings page is open. That's simply so it doesn't interfere with any potential calibration that we're trying to perform. All right, so now to our power calculation settings. So the power calculation settings is sort of, it's how we're telling the software which values to calculate power from. So again, this is important, especially if we have some gearing between the engine and our brake. So it says right here, if we just read it, select which RPM source is equal to the RPM of the brake. So if our sensor is directly sensing the speed of the brake shaft, that is going to be RPM 1. However, let's say that we were actually sensing the engine RPM, but the brake was, geared on a 2-to-1 ratio, which is actually what we have set up in our RPM settings right now. So our engine RPM source would be RPM 1, and then our brake RPM source would be RPM virtual 1, okay? So let's go over that one more time. Select which RPM source is equal to the RPM of the brake. So RPM 1 if we have the sensor sensing the speed of the brake, and then select which RPM source is equal to the RPM of the engine, RPM virtual 1. All right, so I know that's kind of confusing. If you have any questions, please email me. I can let you know, what you need. But hopefully, if you kind of read through this all makes sense. All right, atmospheric correction factors. So when enabled, the SAE or STP atmospheric correction factor is applied to the torque engine channel and all power values derived from it. The torque brake channel always displays the raw uncorrected value. This is because sometimes you want to see the actual torque on the brake and not the corrected value. So you can enable that right here or disable it. So you can see how it changes our engine torque. If we check that, now it's showing corrected torque. All right. So that just about covers everything for setting up your RPM input, your load cell, and your power calculation settings. I think we'll probably cut this video off here because we're getting around 14 minutes at this point. But if you have any questions at all, please feel free to send me an email. That's Sean, S-E-A-N, at PrecisionDynoTech.com, and I'm more than happy to help. Thanks so much for watching, and stay tuned for future videos on other fun settings in the RevBench software. Thanks.